Tuesday train lobby with 2MK team. Today we are finally getting our final preparations for Combo Breaker. For those of us who entered Guilty Gear, that is, or for just getting ready to play as much casuals as possible. Feel free to join up. This is a US East Coast lobby. A loser stays on lobby as well. You can find the search ID in both our tweet and our stream title. Since today we will be working on final steps, and due to the fact that for the most part our brackets are known, we don't expect any changes in the Combo Breaker brackets, which are up. If you are going to that tournament, you can go check them out. It's at least possible to begin your preparations for your opponents. But of course, we go to tournaments to get experience and to pick up new data for our training on top of that. So, the best we can do here is do everything we can to get everything we know about our current opponents, our current training partners. See if we can think of some things for them to pick up to help us practice, or to improve their own play. I'm fairly sure that there is a good reason, even though we don't have a full esports style organization, we did benefit somewhat, I believe, from putting everyone's tag on in the Combo Breaker registration. Do remember this, because if you do have a sort of organization, they'll still let you put it in. It helps them, I believe, with making sure you don't get seeded against your training partners, for example. But fortunately, due to the large number of entrants in other things, even when that didn't happen, it's still fairly obvious. So, with regards to Guilty Gear, I did run into having the same training partner in my pool, but they're far away. Far enough away that we'd only probably meet in winners finals or something if it did come to that. But for that to happen, I would have to be really on point with Guilty Gear. So let's see if we can get there. Because neutral and some understanding of frame data is not going to be enough to get one to a tournament bracket. Not only must you manage most of your combos, if your character depends on them even a little bit, most importantly, you have to manage your resources well to get through tournament stuff. You can't figure out an opponent within the first couple of rounds Basically, only your resource management is going to save you. Furthermore, anything you can do to help you use that resource, that meter, tension, burst, whatever it is, keep the match going just a little bit longer, should almost always be one of your serious priorities, both in Guilty Gear and other games that have such things. So today we'll be working on Gold Burst, and consequently figuring out what to do with your meter once you land that Gold Burst, because there's few things that will mess up well, either the mental state or the overall outcome of matches against certain opponents than you going from no meter to lots of meter on their attack. But it's not going to matter unless you can hit it. And that involves knowing exactly what to do with that meter once you have access to it. This is true for nearly any game you're entering in any tournament. If you want to improve your tournament experience, make sure that your resource management is on point. Because you can drop a combo or two, but you can't drop a game plan. A tournament is a place where your game plan is going to take precedence over anything else. So, don't shortchange yourself on that. Make sure that whatever it is you have worked on, all the combos you've grinded and everything, if you want to cram for a tournament and you don't have really good resource management yet, and meter watching for that matter, grind on that, because that is the thing that will save you in clutch moments. It is the thing that will help you stay calm when you're about to crack. And is the thing most capable of intimidating an opponent. Whereas if you fight someone quite often, it's the little interactions that matter and not the big ones. That's our goal for today. Meter management, Gold Burst, and keeping your game plan in mind no matter what.
これが伝え聞く忍びの技か。まさに虚実混交、合間合間に営業まで挟んでくるとは。アクセル、マザー、ジャム。さあ楽しもうぜ。恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワン、やっちまえ。前から気になってたんだけどさ。はい、まずはジャム。さあ楽しもうぜ。
Since, as you've noted, most of the team has their overall game plan down. It's easy for us to autopilot at least somewhat through these matches. All you have to do is identify when you've dropped your plan, and pay attention to that, and look for spaces to slip in better meter usage or burst. At this point, it's a little bit ambitious to be trying to thinking of new tech to come up with. It's just not going to work out in the long term because there wouldn't be enough time to practice it. At best, you would get better defensive reactions. Or evasion. For example, we can see here that my meter usage in this match is really bad. I've been sitting on a ton of it, and not really been able to do much with it in any direction. When I have used it, it's been fairly telegraphed. Now part of this is the way that Kai moves in general. But at least another part of it is understanding whether or not you have certain options at certain spaces at all. The other thing you can do to help your friends is use some of the defensive stuff, some of the pressure stuff that you don't necessarily use in your style because you know it's easily beaten. This helps them to get ready for other people who may not have the same perspective on the matchup or may not yet have the skills to stop those sorts of things. And once again, you can see, not only did I not use the meter correctly, I ended up freaking out because I didn't use up the meter correctly. Similarly, if you know that there is an easy way to catch your opponent when they're doing particular things that you've given up using because of the matchup and understanding that they have a way out of it, remember to force them to do this. Therefore, for example, against the team now, I will do what I nearly never do. With jam, I don't generally use low pressure because it doesn't convert into much, and most people will just block it. But that does not mean that it's not there for a reason. It is emotionally stressful to face a long string of unclear jam low pressure that might actually open you up eventually. If you're unused to a player who will continually do that and then shift through or parry or all those things, it might end up feeling unfamiliar when you got back around to playing. Therefore, from my side, the best thing I can do for my training partners is to put in that low pressure. If I expect my opponent, for example, to tap out of a lot of it, I can make myself more effective than they are used to, even though the sequence itself isn't that scary, and it generally makes jam unable to do too much after it, So being patient is the key, but because they've trained against me all this time, they don't have this instinct to wait that out, to stick around until the end and try to take advantage after the long, low strength. So, again, if you're training for tournaments with your friends, they probably know you well enough and you know them well enough, but switch to something a little more annoying, probably. As this will help them be ready for strange people in pools. And by strange, I of course mean unfamiliar. Unfamiliar people in pools is almost always a serious problem. One becomes pro by playing the game so much that there's nothing unfamiliar to you anymore. But for those of us who don't have that luxury, who basically can work our day jobs, have other hobbies, have to share gaming, or just have interest in more games, and again, day job, all those things. Once your playtime is cut down to around 2 hours a night, even that is usually not enough to become familiar with every main approach or strategy that someone can take in a matchup. So, in these situations where you know hey, we're prepping for a tournament, you're not necessarily playing for the same type of fun. You're playing to maximize the fun when you get to the tournament. So, annoy your friends as much as possible. Whatever you can think of that is obnoxious and cheap and has an easy counter or isn't real but they haven't faced in a while, do that. Especially since it will remind you why that setup is useful and how you might be able to use it to take other players who are then the ones who are facing you as the unfamiliar opponent. At least remember why you should mix it in with your regular playstyle. So you can help both sides by just being annoying. But we also have our Faust from before, which is, in this case, slightly useful because it is altogether a new experience for some of us. Or if not completely new, new enough that they haven't built up any specific way of playing this matchup to the point where it's like, okay, I already have an entire plan for you. So in this matchup at least, we can talk about some basics. First of all, lock on wake up. Faust does not have great Oki in the first place. Faust Oki is relatively dependent on what item is out, or whether or not it's a good idea for you to jump back, because there are certain wake-ups you can jump back out of with Faust. But for the most part, block. And hope that he doesn't have the bomb. That's basically it. The other thing is that most characters crouching dust is a really effective way to push Faust back so that you don't have to deal with most of his stuff. So on that note, I'll go ahead and shorten the line a little bit. since the Jam Faust matchup is such a bust in the first place, for me anyway, that even practicing it will do nothing. It also helps if you have the understanding beforehand with your friends that yes, I'm going to be annoying and play as cheap as possible. Because better here than in tournaments. You're investing some frustration now so that one is less frustrated after a long car or plane ride. Sometimes this is all you need to remind your comrades of some small solution they have to the problem. Even if they don't necessarily remember immediately, and maybe if they've never told you what the solution was because you just skipped that phase of the matchup for whatever reason. They may be able to suggest something. You may come up with something on your own. Or if you happen to have a spotter, the spotter might come up with something. It is true that if you go to tournaments, there will be quite a lot of people willing to help you understand how to fix the problem. But why not have that beforehand? The more things you can figure out to fix before you get there, the higher level the things that beat you will be, most of the time. And therefore, the more you get to learn. This matchup is made a little more complex because Faust doesn't really have any good reason to try to Oki Axel's wake-up. But he does have enough range to throw out a ton of items where Axel won't be able to do too much about it. So it's mostly just waiting until something good comes out of the randomizer and taking advantage of that as soon as you see it. Axel therefore has two ways to approach the matchup. The first, which you should probably take on if you're comfortable with anti-airs and aerial opponents, is to air dash from basically full screen. This is not because Faust has no way to deal with it, but mostly that the way that Faust deals with it changes the rest of his game plan. Axel gets to continually jump forward, ping, go back, jump forward, ping, go back. And it's just enough to make a Faust player a little bit nervous about which items they throw out, or how much time they spend in the air. They are likely to try spending more time in the air to resolve your problem. The other way to do this is to stand just inside Faust's item range and trust that the randomizer will go in your favor instead. This is for the gambler who plays rushdown style for a lot of characters anyway, or understands this anyway, and is comfortable taking some risks. Obviously you could change midway, but Faust is a little less intimidated if things weren't going your way to begin with, so it's probably best not to try to change it. The key in both cases is that once Axel is too close to Faust, he generally must rely on his reversal and moving away from the character quickly. Because while Faust can hit you from quite far and confirm into it, there are certain movements and certain methods of getting away from Faust that can improve your situation fairly quickly if your opponent doesn't get good randomizers. Since Axel's crouching dust is a little less scary to most characters, and Faust is not often at the range where standing dust is a great idea, it requires a lot of use of weird counters and reversals and trusting that Faust will keep on attacking. The good side of this is that if the Faust player refuses to keep on attacking and starts to try to make distance, Axel has slightly better control of the distance over most of the match. But as usual, this match I don't talk much about. Both players are very familiar with how the other plays, and therefore are best served by being more annoying. One of the other ways that it helps is if you happen to basically accidentally realize that something that wouldn't seem like a good idea that you naturally do because of how else you've been trained against that opponent still happens to beat the annoying strategy. This is really important tournament level information. If you were able to find that for whatever reason, something you were already doing due to your opponent not using annoying thing number one also happens to beat it most of the time, this tells you that you don't have to adapt your strategy if you meet someone like that in tournaments, which means you get to stay comfortable for longer and focus on whatever part of the matchup you're facing actually gives you problems. This is actually one of the most important pieces of information you can ever get. An unconventional thing you are doing that you built up through a long system of trying to one-up your opponent's tactics somehow cycles back around and still wins against the primary tactic. Meter management is a different beast in different games. Games like Under Night have multiple meters and functions to think about. Some are timed, some are built up, and some, depending on your character, are created. Guilty Gear generally does with just burst and the 1 meter, but that 1 meter builds up quickly and is used for tons of things, each of which tends to vary by matchup. Johnny is another must block on wake up character, but he gets much less advantage than even Faust if you happen to actually do it. However, Johnny does have some options for when you don't. It's just that they tend to be very intensive for him. And your own ability to use meter to get out of this stuff is quite good, meaning that if you can get at least a little bit of meter built up before Johnny can get his first knockdown, and then just block, you're probably good. If you don't manage to get the wake up, you're going to have to put up with the Johnny mix-up one way or the other. The second thing to understand is, of course, that you only have to block for a certain amount of time. And you must generally work out what exactly that amount of time is and become comfortable with moving directly after it. You can get caught sometimes, but the chances that Johnny will do something unsafe and put himself under stress if you happen to block for a little longer increases. This is another matchup that we mostly know well, but Axel can increase the amount of air control and reversals he uses to stress answer out a bit more. Since this match can be played extremely patiently once you get the life lead, one of the stronger methods for Axel to beat a new answer in tournaments is to see what happens in terms of their damage output. If Answer's damage output and combos are not that high, Axel can mostly just expect to be able to poke his way to a victory without having to do much setup or try to get in of his own. In the end, one simply just doesn't worry enough about what little damage Answer can do if the player is stressed out, and ignore the fact that Axel's damage at those ranges is also normally not that good. Eventually they will come in trying to take off some health. If you get hit, it's probably not that big a deal. If they get it wrong, you get a big punish. As you can see here, for example, patience is all that's required to win this match, and in a tournament, that's what you're aiming to do. Eventually, you'll just win by attrition. The reason this is important in tournaments is because, against unfamiliar players, you really don't want to be giving them potential chances to do a lot of damage to you, or going in too hard and possibly stressing yourself out. You have a lot of matches to play if you intend to go through most of the tournament. If you win, you have a lot of matches to play. If you lose early, but only once. In our current double elimination tournaments, you still have a lot of matches to play. In fact, you have much more. It is important, therefore, to work on your defensive confirms and reactions into big damage, because this will help you deal with those sorts of situations in tournament, first of all, and just generally intimidate your opponent more. We want to intimidate tournament opponents as much as possible, so that they don't try anything crazy and force us to move too far outside of our game plan. Similarly, Answer benefits a lot in this matchup from having the awareness to punish Kai's whiffs. Answer often puts Kai at spaces where, unless Answer himself sticks out a button to play footsies, most of Kai's stronger attacks will be blocked at max range or whiff entirely. If you can punish these whiffs with full combos, you can absolutely intimidate your opponent into not hitting things, which gives you more freedom to play footsies, get pressure, move into positions you like, and hit buttons in neutral. No one's going to want to take a chance on taking 30 to 40% health damage off of raw Vapor Thrust. And the sort of person that does take that damage, or that risk I should say, is often the sort of person that does it regardless of anything else, and you will probably be able to win out based on just making sure you know how to do that damage. Expectation is a large part of fighting games, but the execution to punish people for actually doing the thing you expect is absolutely an important thing to practice when you're headed to tournament level stuff. Fortunately, this is not one of the things you need actual players to practice as much. All you need is a quick CPU recording at a particular range, and you should be able to manage. What you need your friends for is, once you've got that recording and you've figured out exactly what the optimal punish is and feel like you've got it under control, to create enough stress to see if you can do it in those sorts of conditions. Since in most games you can't count on the CPU for everything you want to learn to punish, and not every game has multiple recording slots to cause some mix-ups or other trickery, once you've practiced enough with your friends, go back to the lab and practice there, and then come back to your friends to practice some more. Johnny's main problem in this matchup is his problem in practically every matchup. Moving forward is hard. Therefore, Kai can afford to be patient and block a lot of stuff because, as you can see, not only does he tend to trade with Johnny in particular spacings, Johnny's spacings don't end up being that good for him, and they tend to cost him a lot of meter. Kai's disadvantage is that once Johnny does get started and is determined enough, Kai has trouble gathering enough tension meter of his own to counterattack a lot of this stuff. He spends a lot of time in the blocking stance, and it's very risky to check Johnny with buttons. Therefore, once you get a knockdown on Johnny and you have full screen, take all that space, move away. This is not because Johnny can't fight from long range, not at all. It's more so because you, as the Kai player, now for just a moment have control of that long range. Closing in on him is just creating the situation he wants again. Because while he cannot necessarily break your guard from far away, he absolutely can move forward and try to hit you, forcing you to defend at his pace and in his ranges. And of course, Johnny being a character who's really good at conversions, basically wins all scrambles. He is not, however, so great at this sort of thing. Once you've learned the ranges at which Johnny cannot pursue a Kai backdash, the rest becomes relatively rote overall. Forcing Johnny into the similar things to when Kai is playing against shorter range characters. He has to end his block strings so that he doesn't give you space to do things. So make sure to take the space Johnny gives you if you have a projectile or some other very quick screen crossing move with an advantageous spacing at the end. In Axel's case, one can remind your friends that he actually does have annoying block strings. It's just that you probably stopped using them because they would always block them. Then they got used to not blocking them. Rotate through. Make sure that you have a clear idea of what is going on. One of Answer's best options for his own meter is to use his Roman cancel defensively to see which of Kai's attacks from a particular range is even happening. From there you can decide whether or not to simply hit his crouching S or attempt to use his counter. It really is just those two things, so you don't worry too much. There's a space where Kai is supposed to try to approach, and Answer can just literally Roman cancel just to see what's going to happen. If nothing happens, he's at advantage anyway. It's yellow Roman cancel. This may seem like a waste of meter, but if you consider the amount of damage Answer saves himself by extending the ability to react to Kai's movement, you can see why it benefits in the long run. And since there's not much else that the meter gets used for, you should think of it in a different way. If you were willing to use the meter to do Answer's super, to beat it no matter what it was, then you should have been equally willing to use the meter to see what it was so you could beat it. Especially since one gives you advantage in position and the other does not. Also, you know, generally on average they use equal amounts of meter. If you assume that half the time you hit the Roman cancel your opponent was doing nothing, the amount of meter you use to deal with those situations is about the same. The same sort of occurrence happens against Johnny, but it's rather in that case to tell whether or not Answer should go into the air. Since Johnny covers those airspaces so well, Answer doesn't know whether or not it's safe to jump. And the slowdown way that it works means it's very difficult for him to actually get anything. Since he can use this on both recovery and neutral, it tends to, relatively speaking, pay for itself. Similarly, Answer can use just basic movement and timing to try to counter out of some of Johnny's block strings when you've gotten used to the block string your opponent uses. But like mentioned before, you have to wait until the end of Johnny's block strings or try to identify the end of those block strings so that you can do this. If you are impatient and move too early, there's no way for Answer's counter to be fast enough to get through anything Johnny does. If you do it too often, your opponent is more likely to think of throwing coins at those times, which may mess everything up. It is partly for this reason that the low perches are set in this matchup. Axel loses a lot of the sureness of his air control once those are available. Therefore, even though it is not usually possible to increase Answer's damage too much in this way, reducing the amount of control Axel has over movement in the matchup, and the amount of time he has to spend hitting things that he otherwise would not need to, Answer can create mix-ups in the mind of the Axel player simply by having those perches out. Meaning that winning off of just getting the life lead and holding it becomes a little more stressful. It therefore becomes important for Answer to use his knockdowns to place perches rather than anything else. And since Axel is not likely to give him a lot of chance to do that placement otherwise, one might have to grind on the instinct of knockdown into placement. The good part about Answer's versatility in these matchups is that even when the player knows what you're going to do, he's not a character you can really stop from doing it. You can only do something else in the hopes of catching him doing it. As you can see demonstrated there, when one has a relatively clear idea that Answer is eventually going to start just teleporting out or otherwise blocking the attack that follows your block string, or just jumping in certain cases depending on where you spaced yourself, you end up delaying or entirely stopping the block string. Once Answer has that freedom of movement, that momentary pause where he knows that you are hesitant to attack because he might escape you, he can use his other escapes to try to get out of it. Johnny, like most such characters, can stop anything you do, but he would have to have some idea you were going to do it. This is why it is so important for Johnny players to be able to stress their opponent into not blocking, challenging block strings, and just generally being impatient. But as mentioned before, Axel's grind against Faust is a lot more about taking the space you get and either specifically choosing to respect or disrespect the randomizer. Being inconsistent in this brings the match down to basically actual luck. As you can see here, since Faust must often move to continue his attacks on Axel before he actually can confirm what the item was, Axel can get a lot of damage out of just disrespecting the randomizer altogether. And just accept that sometimes it won't go in your favor, sometimes you'll get a meteor dropped on your head. But you can see here the unfortunate outcome of switching midway. The Faust player's mentality has already shifted by the time they've gotten to that point of the match. So they're not going to stop throwing them in the hopes that you'll stop. Unfortunately, for many an Axel player and many a Jam player who has to try to get in even worse, this entire experience just comes down to feeling like pure luck, because no matter what you do, you have to make the choice of whether or not to go full in on either respecting or disrespecting the randomizer. The Faust player is counting on the fact that you will try to guess, but neither Jam nor Axel allows Faust enough time to confirm what he threw out and still take his action. Another reason for this type of training, of course, is simply the sheer frustration of going to a tournament and losing to something you could have lost to at home. What makes you a tournament player is when you know that whatever it is that you go and see will either be because you had a bad day and somehow you dropped a combo or a response that you can do 90% of the time, or an entirely new thing has happened. This matchup, once you have learned to block on wake up, is a lot easier. Because if Answer can find a moment to put a perch over his head at all, his own head, avoiding nearly everything Faust does is trivial. Faust's pressure, however, is a problem for this character. But as you can see, you can use your burst to get out of that fairly early. And this will give you the exact situation where you have set up those things. If you get too used to characters who have quick waves through the air and can damage you from full screen and those things, it will become very stressful when you face a character who you should try to keep out, but don't remember that you have to do that. As you can see, Faust's ability to do damage to Answer when Answer is on the perch just over his head at nearly full screen is really small, or requires a lot of meter. He can also, of course, throw down an item, and if the randomizer happens to favor him, you can do some stuff. But Answer always has the option to simply go right under most of the items, or just go straight into some of them if necessary. The way that Answer interacts with items when he slides across the ground can vary quite a lot, but most of the time he won't get hurt. As noted here, the mix-ups happen not because Answer gets onto the perch, but because of the number of things that Axel has to think about when Answer is near one of them in the air. Axel's slower moves mean that in order to counter things that could happen from it, he must hit the button fairly early and will often get caught in just regular jumping, forcing Axel into a situation where his best bet is actually just straight defense. Which you can count on the fact that many Axel players don't exactly have a lot of practice at perfect defense. In short, put down perches so you can jump, and if you feel as if not even that is going to let you jump, then use it. Axel can take this option to go on the offensive in the air himself, but it's relatively easy for Answer to counter this with a lot of good normals, some decent anti-airs, and all of his trickery with coming out of cards or teleporting. Since Axel also has very little option to prevent Answer from throwing cards in the first place, it's easy to set up lockdowns in this situation. Axel must train his defensive play very heavily to save himself against this sort of thing. Fortunately, the reward for proper defensive play on Axel in this situation is usually a large amount of damage. He also has a relatively high freedom of movement by simply not trying to counter the motion of Answer and just go straight at him sometimes. This allows Axel to build up meter, which he's normally relatively starved for in this matchup if Answer is playing correctly. However, it is almost impossible to keep up with Answer's meter gain. If Answer is playing correctly. Apple is simply not built to deal with characters with this much freedom of movement. And therefore your confirms and punishes have to be relatively on point if you want to win out in the long term of this. As noted there, dropping even one can lead to a huge meter deficit. And you can imagine what this matchup becomes like when Answer starts to use Roman cancels to shift around the spacings that he's using in neutral, or the other really big problem for Axel in this matchup, Answer's air super. It is again not a problem because he's likely to get caught in it too much under normal circumstances, but rather that it's easy to bait Axel into getting hit by it by causing him to focus on the number of positions and timings that Answer has available to decide whether or not to respond. When there are no perches, there are no air tricks. Sometimes your best option is to go for the punish immediately. But if Answer happens to trick you into that and use the air super, you may be in a lot of danger. Especially if they have really large amounts of meter and can cancel out upsets. This is an example of a round where the randomizer has absolutely not gone in Axel's favor, and the one time that Axel didn't challenge it was the time it would have. Unfortunately, sometimes you just have rounds like this. With both characters having such range, it's difficult to get a solid advantage in this matchup for Axel, even with his new crouch heavy. But because of Faust's general movement, it takes a very patient Faust before you have to care about things like wake up, bend him. It's just generally a good idea to go for it. If you are decided to play disrespectful, just be disrespectful outright. What's he gonna do about it in the end? This is an example of a round where Axel just went, you know what, I'm not respecting anything you throw at me. I'm going to take my chances that these are all going to be weak or ineffective and do a ton of damage. So my advice to anyone playing this matchup, decide which of the two things you want to do. Don't half-ass it. Axel's damage and ability to get out of things with his burst are good enough to keep up with Faust, unless you're really lucky. Well, the Faust player is really lucky, that is. The rest is just a matter of learning which mix-ups happen at close range, what loads you have to deal with, and so on. And at that point, you're just losing purely by character unfamiliarity. And this being literally the only game, except, is it BlazBlue? I think BlazBlue, where you can say that you got randomed out, and that be completely true.
初めて見たぜ。これが企業戦士ってやつか。
When you recognize our player's patience is slipping, you don't necessarily have to have a real meaty, bulky wake-up setup. Just a quick one. Or some that starts from a range where you don't think they'll be able to hit you as a counterattack. Playing Answer, like playing Eno, requires a strong sense of where you want to be in half a second. Or less than that, actually. Neither character can afford to spend too much time thinking about where the opponent can get to or is going to be. On the upside, they're both rarely really good at locking the opponent down from getting into those positions. The most important part, therefore, is actually to learn when to disregard the fact that your opponent did something unexpected and got to a position you didn't want them to. Unexpected risky moves are a part of any fighting game. But if you allow them to discourage you from your own game plan, you can suffer in pools at tournaments simply because your opponent does one or two unexpected things and you psychologically fall apart. One of the most important things for playing against unknowns is the ability to, in the middle of the match, ask yourself, did the thing that they just did really matter to me? If I were to fight someone who did this all the time, would I actually care? Sometimes it's not even would I manage to punish them or hurt them. Would you care? Would you have a reason to feel as if this was a threat to you? If the answer is no, let them keep doing it, see if they will. It will give you time to calm yourself, think about the matchup, think about other things that you could use in the matchup that you don't normally use, and avoid large amounts of stress. Showing off tech that doesn't harm your opponent can also be helpful. Many of us are not as aware that fighting games can contain a lot of what we will call evasive hurt boxes. A way to put your character into a position where another player's move whiffs entirely. Not because you moved out of the way back or forward, but that you went over it or under it. 3D gamers, 3D fighting game players, I should say, tend to be more familiar with this, and 2D games don't immediately give you the impression that they have a lot of these in them. But they definitely exist, and they can help you to stay calm in matches, even though they usually don't result in a lot of damage. For example, if Axel believes that Kai is going to just throw the fireball and not come toward him, just a single one on the ground, he can actually use some of his crouching moves to low-profile those entirely. It doesn't come up often because most of the time, if Kai was throwing it with that intention, you don't want to commit yourself to a move, you want to just block. But if there were a situation in which just blocking could lead to you being in a bad state, for example, if you really didn't want Kai to put down a grinder without getting challenged or something, you do have these options, and more importantly, in the tournament scene, you may meet someone whose concept of how to play the matchup is so totally different that that is their go-to response for those sorts of things. A little familiarity from your training partners never hurts. So it is these things that we are attempting to put together before we head off the combo breaker. Once again, we will be leaving on the Thursday. That means there's no Friday stream and there is no Thursday stream. Tomorrow's stream, we're not even sure what that will cover. It might be open mic. But it's unlikely to be another lounge. We're not in fact planning to shift Dragon Ball due to the preparation time required. So expect one of our shorter, probably Street Fighter streams, or maybe some Dead or Alive action. It has been announced that Dead or Alive will be returning to EVO 2018. Which is good news for us because we're fans, even if we don't actually end up playing it that often, it's nice to see it. And if you can only go to a certain number of big tournaments, if you want to choose a couple that are not necessarily in range of you normally, well, EVO is normally the one people choose. Combo Breaker coming in a fairly close second for most people. Being central really helps out. This matchup is also one we've recently seen a lot of work done by both players to work out how they choose to approach the other. Jackal continually makes Axel work harder and harder, but in the end, this benefits her much more than it benefits him. The increased strength and speed of minions mean that eventually Axel can be overwhelmed, and any life lead he was holding onto will probably disappear if he didn't manage to get rid of houses while he was doing it. This unlocks almost all of Jackal's tricks, as just seen there, and if she absolutely must win by timeout, she will do that. But this is in no way to say that it's easy to do this, because the neutral that Jackal must play in order to eventually properly defend her houses relies on Axel being knocked back fairly early in a particular moment in the match. If you don't manage to knock Axel back before Jackal ends up in the corner, it's too difficult to defend houses because there's no way to push Axel entirely out of the space where you can hit them. Therefore, one of the first things you need to work out in this match is what is your opening gambit and how do you quickly capitalize on it from there. Once you've got the opening gambit out, the rest of the situation is the uphill struggle for Axel, not Jackal. This is also because the amount of time it takes Axel to destroy one house behind him is easily offset by Jackal being able to put down 2 houses where she is. If Axel happens to have all 3 houses near him, or even just 2, she usually has the capacity to pull them back to her. This resets the situation at minimum, or she can go the other way entirely and let him destroy them for some other bonus that she can effectively cash in over time. There's a lot of planning involved in this matchup, but it all starts from that opening gambit and flows 2 entirely different ways for Jackal and Axel based on who happens to win it. Therefore, learning the maximum number of opening gambits on both sides is most helpful for tournaments because you don't want to get taken off guard by any and pushed into a stressful situation against a Jackal that may have an unfamiliar style, or an Axel that is aggressive enough to push Jackal to the corner quickly.
戦においてはまず相手の背後を見ることです。態度があれば知恵、なければ決死の覚悟を持って弱王
パフォーマンスも把握しとくか。まあいいわ。応戦します。
恨みっこなしだ。デュエル。新しい仲間か。
One of the things that makes this matchup difficult for our Jackal player is that she normally plays Bison. Which means that she normally spends more time thinking about how to hold a back or down charge than purely on getting out of the way. But in this matchup, Jackal can benefit from just directly backdashing without going into the air first. A habit that will have to be built up over time. This is not because Jackal has a particularly great backdash. But rather, the fact that it doesn't need to be. That's the entire intention. Jackal's backdash is the perfect range to get out of the way of things and then punish a lot of other things. Combine this with a ton of moves that the opponent can't do anything about on reaction, and you have a character who can avoid most of Slayer's full-on pressure by tapping back twice. As you can see, this is very similar to other training we've been doing in Street Fighter recently. Our newly released Kata 34 is basically just this. Wait until your situation has become favorable and execute something while waiting to see if your opponent jumped or went into the air some other way. Or hit a button. That's all you care about. Once you've gotten to the point where you can feel comfortable just executing the escape and watching them, then you can start to think about how do I deal with those things once they have occurred. Jackal also has some capacity in this matchup to backdash out of her own pressure. But it's not usually at the end of the block string. She has to cut her block string short to get out of them. This is usually fine if she has enough minions to help push, or is just about to have minions to push. On literally the opposite side, our Slayer player has been working on dashes as a generality. The Slayer's dash is both confusing and difficult to do with pure reversal timing. Understanding what situations it will and won't get you out of is therefore hard information to gather when you can't be sure if you didn't get out because you mistimed the dash or didn't get out because you can't dash at that moment. Evasive moves are often limited in this way, and it takes longer for players to learn them for this reason. Evasion and counter-hit technology in fighting games, particularly 2D ones, tends to come up much later into the game's life when you've had enough players who were daring enough to keep trying something that could entirely fail for long periods. And since most of the time this is not something you can practice against the CPU, it can be emotionally stressful because you are literally telling yourself, I'm going to keep failing at this thing until I either get good enough at the execution to know if I could or could not get out of this, or my opponent starts to respect it. The latter does not tend to happen quickly. But it can be very discouraging because even when one has become finally confident that you are executing it correctly, that might just be a confirmation of all those times you got hit while trying to do it. You might just have learned, okay, it actually doesn't work. We absolutely don't suggest learning your evasive tech first. Stick to something where you can just read the frame data and decide whether or not it works or not. But there absolutely are ways to grind these things. So whatever game you're using, see what options your training mode gives you, so that you can perhaps poke at the opponent, perhaps set up things, perhaps use resets and try to execute instantly, and so on. Whatever you need to make it realistic enough that you are confident in your execution, and at that point can be sure, okay, the reason I'm losing is because this move actually doesn't work in this situation, and not because I'm too slow. Now we have another new matchup, more or less. Jackal vs Faust is super hard for Jackal in one specific way, and really easy in a different one. Jackal can fly. That's the simplest explanation for how this match is won. Jackal can fly. That's the only thing you really need to remember about it either. Whether or not you choose to play offensively or defensively against Faust, the end result is always based on the fact that Jackal can fly. The difficulty for her is making sure she has enough meter to fly in the way she needs to, and seeing the correct moment when Faust is likely to pause due to her doing that to get a house down. Faust relatively suffers from her having her kick house down. And beyond that, Jackal can fly. The difficulty is that when you decide to fly with Jackal, it's hard to make yourself stay up there. Most of us want to attack, to play footsies, to block the opponent from advancing whenever we see the option. But Faust's effective attack range is so large that he can literally go up beneath her and hit her. The only thing that prevents this is, again, usually the kick house or enough meter to make sure that he can't do it. Otherwise, he'll just wait for her to come down and clip her out of the air at the last moment. There are lots of ways to avoid this fate, but overall, none of them help too much. The good thing is that if you can get a house behind Faust, particularly kick house, he doesn't have a lot of ways of dealing with it and not a lot of ways of forcing you to shift to positions you are disadvantaged in. So, using that as your basic start, you can build up which strategy you prefer from there. Similar to here, where Axel's reaction to destroy one house leads to him having to deal with two more. And since Jackal doesn't really need more than one house at a time to at least stress Axel out, she can absolutely afford to try to put down just one and figure out how to move Axel around the screen at that point, rather than the other way around. Her various abilities, increasing the speed or whatever else of her minions, from there just make Axel's grind way worse. And again, when she has just one house, she often doesn't care that much. It's Axel that must do all of the hard work. And most of the time it just comes down to, can she make him open himself up and lose off time or some other thing. The Axel player in turn has to choose when to just ignore the fact that he has minions around him and go, you know what, fine, I'll just try to kill you. Because one house is still only enough for harassment. It's not enough to set up big death. And every hit will remove any threat that she was posing, given that the minions will go away, and unlike most other characters, Axel doesn't care enough about that. He has such a large extension of his attacks that he doesn't have to worry about only hitting the first minion in the wave, for example. He'll tend to get them all, or clip Jackal if she was moving too aggressively, and the situation will go back in her favor. Jackal in turn must learn how aggressive she can be against any given Axel. And for situations like this, hope that Axel loses track of any minions she does have coming out. However, you can just look at her screen to decide whether or not she has any out, so this is not likely to work on high-level Axel players. It can at least help with mild distractions though. With our other Axel style, the situation is mostly the same. Work out the opening gambit, get one house, and use that house as a distraction to get two. But again, the main difference with this one is that if you are too aggressive, you're likely to get clipped by smaller damage that causes you to lose your army. So the best thing you can do for yourself normally, since you can't afford to be too aggressive, but you also can't afford to just do nothing, is mostly that. While Axel can stand block quite a lot of moves, and doesn't have to worry too much about things, Jackal's Hop Stomp, let's call it Hop Stomp, also helps her stay out of the way of certain attacks, and creates scrambles that Axel benefits from very much less than she does, as you can see there. This is the evasive hitboxes as mentioned before. Being able to high profile some of Axel's zoning concepts, especially in combination with incoming kickhouse minions, means that Jackal can at least stand a better chance of being in the field long enough with minions to do something. Note again that this works specifically because this Axel player's style has a lot more to do with hitting things quickly and getting advantage in the mid-range by that than the other we've been dealing with so far. Simply put though, the number of baited attacks that Jackal can create just by jumping a little bit and doing nothing, or using that same attack in neutral, makes it very similar to how Bison and Cell play, just with armies. Once she has enough support, the opponent cannot jump out of or avoid certain of her attacks at all and have to put up with the block string, leaving it completely in Jackal's favor and just a matter of how well she can track which minions are where to know which part of the pressure to use. Against the more patient style of Axel that pokes in the mid-range, obviously you'll get clipped out of that move or the approach required to set up a close range to do it, and should just rely on the aforementioned spacing and minion baiting style attacks. Other such evasive hitboxes come up quite a lot in games with what we will call full screen zoners. As they generally have fairly direct attacks, the vector can be not only seen but often predicted. Even Axel, who does have the option to curve his attack back up to keep you out, can face situations where the opponent has a move that brings them just back a little bit so they don't get hit by that, and they still get in to put pressure on him. This usually only happens at basically full swing. But any delay in this in order to make the decision usually means that the initial attack was too slow. It is often true against these full-screen zoners that trying to get closer to them first is not a way to actually win the matchup. Despite the fact that they are often called full-screen zoners, if they're not using projectiles for it and are just using very long normals or implements or other things that are meant to cover a lot of space, the trade-off for this is that the attack is almost always going to be slow and cannot be used independently of the character, unlike a projectile, which for the most part you can send out and just wait. This means that if you can get far away from them first and lure them into doing it, you may have a better chance. Once again, we see the overall effect of sometimes just disrespecting false items. Axel is decently capable of doing this, regardless of anything else. From there, it's just a matter of some good lows and wake up to keep your own confidence going more so than anything else. Well, that one's new. It appears, ladies and gentlemen, we've been thrown off the train. And we will have to make our connection again. We'll find out in a little bit whether or not the train was taken off the tracks due to maintenance. Or not. Well, the team has confirmed that for the most part, we're all seeing outright that we can't connect at all, so it's not just one thing. Maybe the RSS servers blew up, let's hope no one was hurt. But it looks like for tonight, the Tuesday train has in fact been either derailed or taken for maintenance without warning. Tomorrow will again be some form of Street Fighter content. It might be sandbag, it might be the teams working out their final preparations for their pools. It might be open mic just to pass the time. There will be no Thursday stream and no Friday stream and no Monday stream either, most likely. You might get a Monday Mishmash Lounge, but we're doubting it. So technically that means the next time we'll see most of you is again next week on the hopefully repaired Tuesday train. This is Marillion for 2MK. See you at Combo Breaker, and good night.